Thanks, Phil and Council, for the invitation. I'm wearing a mask because I collected a bit of a sniffle overnight, but I've tested negative for the dreaded virus, so I'm fairly confident that I'm not infective. So, if I sit down here...
Yes, we can get it. Are you happy to talk on the microphone just for those who can't?
Yeah, if this... Oh, that's for you. Okay, all right. Just my credentials. Today I'll talk a little bit about the Flora and Fauna Society, but I'll also...
That's what this one's for.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Right. Is that...
Yeah, we're on.
Is that on now? Can you hear now?
You have to talk into it that way.
I have to talk into it. Like that?
Yes.
We good? You're good.
Yeah.
All right. I'll briefly come to talk a little bit about the Norfolk Island Flora and Fauna Society, which I describe as the host body for citizen science here, and that's possibly contestable, but we can talk about that. But I'd also like to talk about my background in the science community in Australia. So I'm really coming as an Australian scientist, talking about how I would see citizen science in the island. So science is a never-ending search for causes in the natural world, and it works by pitting observations or evidence against hypotheses with the attempt to develop a theory, and that pitting of evidence against hypotheses is never-ending until the theory is superseded or it crumbles, and the theory is what explains cause and effect. So every proposition is subject to contradiction in future, and science doesn't claim truth. But you can see that a scientific background is actually quite useful, or should be deemed to be useful, for any politician because of the emphasis on cause and effect. And if you look at some of the failures of policy and politics, it's because politicians jump to a solution that they think might be politically desirable without thinking through what's the reason for this. Okay, so if there's a crime wave, you lock the villains up instead of thinking or looking, why are people committing crimes? What are the conditions? Anyway, I'm getting off the track, so I'll move on to science here. Citizen science is a relatively new term, and I would say approximates an earlier term of natural history. Scientific observations conducted by citizens, whether or not they're credentialed scientists. So the possession of qualifications is not a criterion or an issue. But citizen science is normally conducted outside the scholarly or academic institutions. The Norfolk Island Flora and Fauna Society is the main host for visiting scientists, and it also is the host of citizen science activity, such as the conservation volunteers, which Jude organises. So science in the Western tradition builds upon Aristotle, who was arguably the first scientist, and also identified 13 fallacies or poor logics which affected human inquiry. And if you avoid the fallacies, then you can derive explanations for the world. In the mid-1660s, there was a movement called the European Enlightenment, which marked the flourishing of curiosity-led inquiry. And the signature shift in thinking was a decline of religious rigidity and a decline of the power of the king over inquiry. So the world came to be understood through observation and not through supernatural forces. And it was based on the generation of evidence through experiment and the application of reason and logic. So the modern civilization we've inherited derives from that process of experimentation, application of reason and logic, and the tracing of cause and effect. You don't have to abandon religious faith to become a citizen scientist, Faith, philosophy, history and arts are all separate fields of knowledge, and they have their own rules and they're all legitimate fields of knowledge. This is where the Royal Society of London first met in 1660, and it was the first the first modern, I should say, the first Enlightenment and first modern scientific institution. And that continues to this day, and the successor, when Australia was colonised, each of the colonies established its own Royal Society, which was a learned society that emphasised inquiry. In 1665, the Royal Society of London launched the first journal dedicated to science. And it was called Philosophical Translations when philosophy had a different meaning. Philosophy sort of meant knowledge. Giving some account of present undertakings, studies and labours of the ingenious, look at that curious word, ingenious, in many considerable parts of the world, not limited geographically. So, right in those early days, 1665, that's nearly 400 years ago, the first journal had the functions of the modern scientific journal, which is registration, like provenance, and the date stamping is critical. Who gets to publish something first? Certification, which is peer review by independent experts. Dissemination, like publication, and archiving, like storing for the future. So all of those features of the journal, the modern scientific journal, had their roots in 1665. So knowledge, which can be scientific knowledge, citizen science knowledge, can be disseminated and published in different formats, and they correspond to different levels of authority or, certification. Social media is probably the least reliable. The gatekeepers are who knows who looks after Twitter these days. What's their sifting criteria? How do they sift out rubbish and misinformation? It's often unfiltered opinion. Websites can be very reliable. Wikipedia, I find Wikipedia quite reliable and remarkably so. But the status depends on the status of the hosting organisation, and there are some websites that are rubbish. And this is a problem for the layperson to sift out the rubbish from the reliable information. There's so much stuff on the internet that sometimes it's very confusing to work out what's what. So magazines and newspapers such as the Norfolk Islander that are edited by an experienced or competent publisher with a reputation to protect can be quite reliable. But then there's the scholarly journals which are peer reviewed by anonymous referees. What's happened, Phil? This isn't working.
Foreshadowed something might happen.
What goes on? Next slide. Can I click on the next slide? There we are.
Just use the arrow.
Oh, that right hand. Okay, good. I would regard this as the main scientific website on Norfolk Island, and this is the Flora and Fauna Society. And it's at an early stage, but there's quite a lot of spare capacity there to store knowledge. Not too many videos, Luca. Videos consume space on the web, but there's certainly plenty of room there for written knowledge and limited photographs. So anyone here who has original observations that they would like to disseminate to the world, please let me know. Sorry. Now the main, shifting to Australian mainland, the main non-government science site for Queensland is the Queensland Science Network. I'm not sure about New South Wales. I don't know of a comparable facility in New South Wales, and in any case I think the climate of Norfolk Island is more similar to the mainstream in Queensland, which of course is based in Brisbane rather than in Sydney. The Queensland Science Network is an informal group of about 26 natural history societies, Astronomical Association and the Australian Citizen Science Association, which is a member body, Birds Queensland, Entomology, Geology and so on. They're members, and I would encourage the Flora and Fauna Society here to become a member of this network, as it will allow the members to be in touch with a much wider range of organisations, which include some extremely competent researchers. For example, Jeff Monteith, who is considered one of the 10 people in the world who have species named after them, and the other 9 are dead, including Charles Darwin. So Jeff Monteith is a member of the Queensland Entomological Society, and he was...
How do you spell his second name? I just want to Google him when I go home.
Teith. He came here for a visit last year, collecting. Now, I mentioned the hierarchy of levels of authority of knowledge, and here is an example of... Okay, sorry, this thing is skipping slides very quickly. There's a gap between knowledge that's published in websites or magazines or newspapers and the peer-reviewed journals. Peer review is not a guarantee against fraud, especially in those disciplines where research is sponsored by corporate bodies with a vested interest. Pharmacology and medicine is a classic. In the natural sciences, where so much of the research is public good research, fraud or error is quite rare. But it's the best method that humans have devised for grinding out error and correcting mistakes. The Proceedings of the Royal Society of Queensland is a peer-reviewed journal that appears every year, and there's some copies over here for you to browse through. And just 2 weeks ago, it passed a resolution to regard Norfolk Island as part of Queensland for the purpose of scientific publication. No governance or administrative implications, just for the purpose of science. So the editor of this journal will accept scientific submissions, including short communications and book reviews and things. The Australian Citizen Science Association regards citizen science data that's collected by people as best published in the scientific journals, and that gives scientific credibility, and it also gives international exposure, because the scientific journals are indexed by Google Scholar and other engines. I think that's a restrictive policy, and I've brought up a website of a large trove of earthquake seismological data that's not been peer reviewed, but it's got all the earthquakes in Queensland from 1866 until 2007. And this is published on this Queensland Science Network, which is a citizen science network, not peer reviewed, but potentially immensely valuable to anyone studying earthquakes. And it's better than the published stuff by Geosciences Australia, which doesn't record some of the very fine tremors. Here's another issue of the peer-reviewed journal. Now, I'd just like to briefly touch on the role that citizen science can play as brokers of knowledge. If you look at these circles of knowledge, there's so much separation in, let's say, in Australia. We have reality, which is the problems that are bubbling along in the world. We have the public service, which deals through briefs and submissions to ministers and interdepartmental committees. We have members of parliament who are engaged in a political process who hardly ever read scientific journals. We've got business that's got its own dynamics and its own newsletters and forums. the media that thrives on controversy. We've got the scientists who deal with their own specialties, often very narrow specialties, but often very strongly, unfortunately, constrained by whoever wants to fund them. Once upon a time, public good research was better funded than it is these days in Australia. So there's a lot of dependence of scientists upon who's prepared to give them a grant. And the grant goes for 3 years or 4 years, and this stops at the end of when the money runs out. But civil society, which is groups like Flora and Fauna Society, can act as a broker, such as hosting visits by scientists here, getting stuff into the local media, joining with business, and making submissions to the public service. So there's an enormous role there. And I just mention here some of the forums in which this knowledge of different groups is distributed, and sometimes they just don't talk to each other. An enormous gap between the literacy of some of these groups and the scientific world. So I've just got 2 slides with possible recommendations for Norfolk Island. I'm going to focus on the environmental one because the agriculture and farming is very closely linked to the condition of the ecosystems. There's a statement here which is now 15, 17 years old. Human actions are depleting the Earth's natural capital, putting such strain on the environment that the ability of the ecosystems to support human life can't be taken for granted. The situation is worse now than it was in 2005, and it's a good justification for Norfolk Island to be as self-sufficient as possible. We can't rely on importing food from Australia, and Australia can't rely on supporting itself with some of the negative trends in soil condition, climate, weed growth, overgrazing, erosion, and so on. Fisheries is a classic. Australia is importing fish protein from Africa, of all places. So here are some issues that are amenable to citizen science. The vigour of various crops on various soils, and this includes matching the knowledge of local experienced people with scientific knowledge from the internet or the research literature and documenting it. And I mention apples, for example. We know that apples need a number of days below 5 degrees C before they'll fruit properly, but there are modern varieties of apples that can rise outside that. Which of those would be suitable for here? So there's a citizen science activity to track this in advance and to track it after the introduction of new varieties. I'd love to see some citizen scientists do some work on the soil erosion, which is an insidious creeping threat to self-sufficiency and farming here. There's a lot of pests and animals that are fairly obvious, but there's a lot that aren't, and some citizen scientists who trained themselves in entomology, etc., could be particularly helpful. Like there's a little patch of saffron thistle on Selwyn Pine Road that I've not seen anywhere else, so that should be nipped in the bud, but it would only be nipped in the bud by somebody who recognised it as a pest. We can do a bit more with measuring the aquifer levels, I think, but I bow to Snowy's judgment on that. But it would be nice to get ahead of the game and not have a crisis when the levels have dropped too low for irrigation. And I also think the water quality needs some more consistent monitoring. I've seen some acid flock in some of the streams, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of the soils, some of the waters are too acid for irrigation. So I'd encourage any island resident firstly to join the Flora and Fauna Society, attend one of your Jude's mornings where you'll be surrounded by like-minded, knowledgeable people who will make you welcome. And I'd also encourage you to join some of the specialist natural history societies of your interest. Queensland or New South Wales or even some of the other states. Contribute some observations to the website, the local website, or ask any natural scientist, natural historian for suggestions or things you'd like to do. Thanks for your attention.
Done. So I've got two things to talk about today. One is an introduction to these pest fact sheets that we've developed. There's 5 of them. They're up there if you want to come and get some, or should we hand them out? Oh, you have. So everyone's got one there in front of them. Okay, the idea was that we'd hand them out while I was here, so if people have questions, I'm here to try and answer them. They're set out in a fairly similar format, and the idea is to give some background to some recent arrivals and some other things that have been causing issues for a while. So they're set out as background, some basic biology, the damage, the symptoms, and how you can recognise that you've got an issue. With some of them, there are techniques for monitoring them, if we think that's an important thing to do. And there's some suggestions for management. It doesn't mean if you pick up this and do everything it says on it, you're not going to have issues, because some of the pests are new. As pests, for example, the guava moth and the avocado spotting bug, there's not a lot known about them. So they're relatively new, and there's, they could be difficult to control. So on that note, I don't really intend standing here and talking through them all. So if you want to have a look at them and ask questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Or should we move straight on to citizen science, because that's the other thing I was going to talk about this afternoon. Nodding heads, citizen science it is. Okay, so thanks Jeff for the introduction to citizen science, so we know what it all is now. We've got several sheets here, and it's not those. Could I have a copy of the citizen science bundle? Is there a bundle of them? Thanks. Yeah, host list. I think I have one of those. What is citizen science? I did have. Yes, I have one of those, I think. And one of those. Excuse me, thanks. So the idea behind the citizen science projects has come about because we have a real need for data, and they also make really good community projects for people who are interested. So who are we hoping will step forward and volunteer? And we do have some sign-up sheets here today if anyone's interested in being involved. And the answer is anyone who's interested. It's not a difficult thing. I'm really hoping to be able to launch them, get people interested, and then people work out whether it should be done the way I say, whether it needs changing, whether it can be improved, whether there is more projects that people want to do. But it's virtually a launch, and hope that people make it their own. So there are 2 main areas of gaps in the data that we're trying to address. The one of them is to look at natural enemies of fall armyworm. And the reason we want to look at those is that fall armyworm is here now, and apparently it's causing a fair bit of damage in the maize. IPM programs rely on background control, IPM being integrated pest management. And that's what I do for a living, is I help growers develop integrated pest management programs for their crops. So an IPM program relies quite heavily on background suppression of pests, background suppression by natural enemies. So parasitoids, predators, fungi, birds, they're all natural enemies of your pest, and they occur in your crop whether you're aware of it or not. And so we're looking to develop a system for the farmer where those natural enemies can control the pest as much as they possibly can without too much of our own intervention. So when I was asked to come and have a look and have a discussion around things like fall armyworm, it became apparent that we have no idea whether there are any egg parasitoids or larval parasitoids of the pest. So it seems like a natural progression is that yes, we need to then find out what it is before we can really have a great discussion about how to modify the environment so it's more suitable for them. So that's what we're looking for. So there are two parts to that project. One of them is to look for egg parasitoids. I have a vial of commercially available wasps here. This is Trichogramma prettiosum, and it's from a commercial culture. It's all steeped in ethanol, so they're all dead. But
Is that the size of?
that's the size. So it was a demonstration of how small they are. Yeah, they're tiny. Does everyone have a hand lens? Shall I pass my hand lens around? Do we have one spare we can sort of pass around with them? The idea behind that was they are commercially available, but you'd be better off not introducing anything new if it already occurs here. So the school have taken on this part of the project, and we're going to try and quarantine that for the school so they have that ownership till it runs its course. And if we see, if there's any need to continue that work, then we'll try and get people to help do it. So the school has gone out, they've done their first collection, so they're going out every week and they're collecting egg masses of fall armyworm and they're rearing them back, and they've got quite a bit of equipment apparently. They've got a CT cabinet, which is a controlled temperature cabinet, and they can keep them at the right temperature, and then we're just going to see if wasps come out. It's that simple. You collect them, you keep them for a while, and see if wasps or caterpillars come out. The other part of that project that we don't have anyone to do is to look for larval parasitoids. Larval parasitoids include flies and wasps, and what we want people to do is to form a group to go out and do the work, and be collecting the caterpillars, bringing them back, rearing them out on the maize, and seeing if we're getting any parasitoids coming out. So that's that in a nutshell. The other project is looking at the phenology, which is the study of the cycles of hosts for guava moth and spotting bug. I've got a host list here. I thought I had a host list here. Is there one there? Yeah. We can just, wouldn't mind passing out a couple of those.
That's the parasitic wasp of the fall armyworm, isn't it?
Of their eggs. Of their eggs, yes. Yeah. Yeah, Biosecurity Queensland are doing a lot of work, or they're DAF Queensland again now, I think. They're doing a lot of work with Trichogramma against fall armyworm, and that's the beast they're using. So they're really small because they get all their nutrient from the eggs of moths, and they come out, mate, and go and find more. So just going back to the phenology project, I've got a host list here, which will be incomplete, I'm pretty sure. It's just from internet searches and looking for host lists. It'd be really interesting if we could find some more. And the idea is to find out what else both guava moth and spotting bug are feeding on, and we can work out, that would feed directly into the development of an IPM program. And that is basically it. I've got a lot of paperwork here. We've got standard operational procedures, everything you need to grab it and go. And we'd be really keen for anyone to put their hand up and volunteer. There's one. Do you have any questions? Did you want me to?
It'd be probably quite a good idea for us to all read it and then
Sorry, I
Yeah, rather than make promises that we can't.
Yeah, no, look, that's fine. We sort of thought loosely that we might have a discussion around it, hand out the paperwork, and then maybe have a time later in the week, next week, that, or any time really, people put their hands up and say, yeah, we'd like to be involved. The school are loving it apparently. They're very enthusiastic, and it's going well. Certainly if I lived on the island, I'd do it just out of interest anyway, because that's what I do.
Flora and Fauna Society might have some members who are interested as well.
Yeah, no, I'd hope so. Yeah, that'd be great.
You want to join?
The flora, yeah.
$10, yeah.
Loaning $10 for a backup.
Yeah. Derek, you got a $100 bill there?
Yeah.
So I'll be here till Thursday morning. I'm flying out on Thursday. If anyone wants to contact me or the council or infrastructure, you know, they'll know where to find me.
I haven't got any avocado trees.
You what, sorry?
I haven't got any avocado trees.
It's got a wider host range than that. And so for the phenology, the idea would be that you would have a site where there are a variety of fruit tree hosts, or really anywhere that there's a nice garden. And you'd record on the sheet, on the record sheet, at what stage can you see of the, yeah, that's the right one. So it's just been a matter of tick boxes. So you'd, if the cherry guava was flowering, senescing, had fruit present, had no fruit present, it's just a matter of yes or no. And then over the year, because this will be quite a long project, over the year we'll have a really good idea of when the hosts, particularly for guava moth, are suitable for its reproduction.
It's not only the insect that you're looking for, it's the life cycle of the host.
This one in particular is life cycle of the host. So at what stages are there fruit available for especially guava moth to be breeding on?
So we're not actually looking for the bug, we're looking at the plants and the cycle of the plants? Or
This one at the moment is looking very much at the phenology of the host, so when are they cycling? So if you go to, when I was here last year, there was still quite a bit of guava moth damage. And we found guava moth. In fact, you found some guava moth, so we could show the caterpillars around. And if you stand there in the garden, you can see the stone fruit's finished and it's moved over to here, then it's moved over to there, and that thing's going to be next. So it doesn't have to really do anything, and just drop down to the ground, pupate, come out, mate, and jump straight into that. And that's the cycle that we want to find So citrus is the last one. I guess the big issue for that is guava, the cherry guava weed that's on the island, because that's likely to be a host. And so that's the one probably that in the background we'd like to know most about, because people will say it has 3 or 4 crops a year. Is that right?
When I was a kid, there was always grubs in the yellow guava, we call them. We call the red ones Porpay and the yellow ones were yellow guava. And they almost guaranteed to have
Something in them.
I'm certain it's the same one.
Yeah.
And you still find it, it's still the best and the most consistent to find it in.
Yep.
But there's not that many, it's not as prolific as the red.
Yeah.
Red guava.
So these are discussions to have, especially after we've started to get an idea of what's flowering and where and when. And what we're looking for is an opportunity to target a certain host. So it'd be really onerous to recommend that everyone goes out there twice a day and picks up all their dropped fruit. It's just not likely to happen. No. So if we were to say, okay, we've got a 2-week period where fruit X is a host, and then we've got 3 months after that before anything else is available, if we really get in and nail it then, and we say, okay, and really promote it, you could have 1/10 of the number of guava moths getting around in the next season, and it might make a difference. There's no guarantees with any of this.
What would cause, like the guava moth, I don't say to jump species, but on Norfolk it appeared that it wasn't apparent in citrus. It really only became apparent in citrus, probably in the early 90s.
Yeah.
Eric, when roughly early 90s?
Yeah.
Late 80s, early 90s?
Yep, I agree with that.
And the first time we got it identified was probably the mid 80s, because there was always a grub in the guava moth.
Yeah.
There was always a grub in the guava.
Yeah.
It was just a grub in the guava. Nobody really, they used to kind of say it was codling moth, but codling moth hadn't been recorded. And then the first thing that we found it in and sent off to get identified was in macadamias.
Yeah.
Macadamias. That's when we sent the caterpillars off, and they came back and said it was guava moth.
Yeah.
And then a little bit later, it jumped into citrus. And initially, it was kind of only one area, and then
Yeah.
it was the whole island. So,
That's interesting. I guess if it hadn't been here very long, it might be that it was suddenly didn't have a host, and it can put pressure on insects.
temperature change, something like that.
I don't know.
Dying, or
I really couldn't answer that at all. It's there's very little known about it, but insects have what they call an egg load, and if they have a pretty heavy egg load, like flying around with their legs crossed, they're going to have to find something to put it on. And you know, a female looking for hosts has a whole cascade of triggers. It can start off at landscape right down to standing on it, and the antennae recognising it as a host. So that all changes if they have a really big egg load, and it's a fairly common phenomenon. So they may have just put it on and it worked.
all the larvae really wants is a moist sugar source.
Yeah.
Carbohydrate sugar source to grow on.
Yeah. That doesn't mean they'll necessarily go to all fruit, but the female makes very informed decisions generally on where she leaves her eggs. Yeah. Do you have a question?
How do you kill the guava moth?
Sorry, what's that?
How do you kill it? The guava moth?
It's not that easy to manage. There is no quick answer for that. It's part of the solution we're looking for. So if you read the fact sheet, there's a few suggestions of things you can do. None of them are guaranteed. The more people that do them, we don't know how far they'll fly. So if you have a neighbour a kilometre away who's not dealing with their guava moth, it might end up in yours, it might not. We don't know how far it will go. But it's a...
The Kiwis think that they got...
I guess one of the things on our side is that the Kiwis don't have is that if you were to... if we came up with a way of eliminating it, it's not going to keep coming in from the outside. So we know that all the guava moths that you have on the island originate here. We know that now. So that gives us something to work with and makes this probably more valuable than it would be, say, for the Kiwis.
By saying that, it doesn't mean to say that you couldn't get another windblown introduction.
Very unlikely. Yeah, of course you could, but it's very unlikely, and it's not a probability that I would say would make this, a waste of time.
Because it's just the size of the moth, or?
They're just not, as far as we know, they're not strong flyers. They haven't really dispersed. We're assuming it's one introduction here and one in New Zealand, but I guess their genetics will eventually show that, whether it is or not. But we know they're not going to be a seasonal occurrence that they keep arriving on the island.
I don't know what I said last time, that the New Zealand researcher that was working on it, she wanted us to collect so many larvae,
Yeah.
and she wanted to be able to do DNA, and we never, it was one of those years that there probably weren't that many.
Yeah, yeah.
That they just really were everywhere, and
Well, she's still keen to do work here.
okay.
Yeah, I've been in contact with her about the the fact sheet. And yeah, no, she's still keen to do work here if anyone's interested. But yeah.
How many people do you think you want to do these recordings of the technology? Okay. Obviously, the more the better.
Oh, yeah, definitely more the better. I think if you have more people, then it could be a task that's shared. So if someone can't make it for whatever reason, then someone else can step in. I really couldn't put numbers on it. I mean, I guess it's a project for community outcomes, and like I said, there's no guarantees whether it will work. We could do all this work and just say, well, look, you know, it's not there.
So what does it actually look like? If you've got an avocado tree in your property, you just observe that tree and
yes, you know, hopefully you'd have around that tree, you'd have other hosts. So an ideal site, you get good sites and bad sites, but there'll be sites on the island where you have, you know, half a dozen of these different host trees, and that would be the best site. So if you were to go there, I mean, if every week is too onerous, then every fortnight. I think I actually put every fortnight, but really people can do it however they feel, you know, suits. There's no right or wrong with this.
The ideal situation, in my situation, it would be if it was in my own backyard.
Yeah.
I was doing observations, and then, you know, spare 10 minutes, you can do it, but it means hopping in a car and driving for 10 minutes to do 5. It's not going to happen.
No. Well, look, like I say, it's a community thing, and we're just trying to start the ball rolling and just see what people think, see who wants to be involved, and if we can get it off the ground, that's great. And if we can't, you know, then, you know, it sort of stops there, I suppose.
Ideally, we want people from different areas on the island.
Yeah, as much as you can. Yeah.
What would be quite handy is to get as many people aware of what is trying to be done, so that if they see something
Yeah.
and they haven't got the time to actually go and do the observations, that they can let somebody else that is prepared to do the observations.
Yeah.
It may be worthwhile having a look at this place or that place.
Well, we're sort of hoping that sort of the ideas will spread in the community, and we'll get, you know, a bit of interest, and we can get it up and running. Yeah. So another part of the project, as an aside, is if it really got off and running sort of full steam ahead, we'd start looking for immature spotting bugs as well, to say, you know, this is a new host, we know it's here now, and we would get someone who really knows what they look like to go and check, so we'd have a data verifier. There's a list of roles on some of those SOPs that sort of describe different things. We've got your data collectors, coordinators, data verifiers, and you can also have someone who goes around and say, we found spotting bug larvae on this tree, and we probably, for the integrity of the data, it would be good to have someone go up and double check that to make sure that we have spotting bug, and it is spotting bug that's breeding on that tree.
Or they could take a photo of it and email that to verify.
We could try it, yep. The specimen would be better if someone could go and collect it, and just for verification. But yeah, look, like I say, the project won't look how I've written it. It'll be how people have made it work and owned it and changed it, and yeah, made it much better. That's the hope.
Do you know any good entomologists we could send?
No, they're all rubbish, the ones I know.
I said that I thought I had photos of
The larvae of
the larvae
weevil.
of banana weevil,
Yeah,
and I think this is them here.
I think there's pictures in the handout, isn't there, on the banana weevil borer one?
Tell me, is the thing that they call lawn grub, is that the same as armyworm?
No, it's a different species, and I'm trying to remember the genus that it comes from. I get asked about it quite a bit. I don't know that much about it. It's not something I've really come across. If it's an issue, I'm hopefully going to be coming back early next year, and it's something we could maybe look at then.
Because I just know that I'm from Brisbane originally, and at one point had a newly laid turf because was getting decimated by lawn grub, and there were these blue and red parasitoid wasps that would hover over the grass, and that would tell you whether you had the lawn grub.
Yeah, right.
So I've seen those same wasps here out at Anson Bay hovering over grass, and it was a time when there was a lot of armyworm on the island.
Yeah.
So
Is there any around now, armyworm? Have you seen it?
no, we had a really bad last year. We had them crawling over concrete and swarming up the
Yeah, no, I've heard they do it. Yeah,
terrible.
I haven't seen it.
So that's different to what you're talking
Yes, the fall armyworm is very different. It's different genus, attacks different crops, mostly maize, and it's moved all over the world in the past sort of 5 years. Well, we don't know. These are questions. It might. It'd be great if it did.
I don't know. Is there lawn grub here?
Do you mean
Yeah.
the curl caterpillar? The
You're-
curl grub?
You're
Or
talking
the caterpillar?
See, there's a difference. New Zealand is called, we call grass scrub the cosmopolitan armyworm,
Yeah.
whereas the Kiwis call grass scrub the black beetle.
Yeah.
The larval stage of the black beetle is what the Kiwis call grass scrub. So there's
Yeah.
this confusion. Here we've got both. We've got the cosmopolitan armyworm and we've also got the black beetle. And if you actually dug up your yard at the same time as the cosmopolitan armyworm was going through and counted how many larvae they are for the black beetle, it's probably the black beetle that's doing most of the damage.
They're root feeders, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, root
Yeah,
feeders,
yeah.
And it's a white.
If
But
you
they sort of
came
got
in
black back.
January,
White curl
the
grub.
whole island's
Pearlescent
dead
top body.
Yeah.
grass.
Yeah.
Like it's,
Cattle lose condition, there's no feed, and
Well, they eat the
Wow.
roots of the grass.
it wipes out pretty much everything.
That's still the law.
And that's over summer. So it will be about,
There's the black beetle as
um,
well, when the Kiwis call the black beetle.
it'll be about sort of nowish, mating and laying eggs.
Or grass scrub.
If you leave a light on at night, do you get many moths around it?
Maybe months, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I noticed actually
Smaller than donkey.
going home last night that there were moths all over the grass.
Ah, really?
Yeah. I don't know.
What was that, sorry?
I noticed after last night's session when I got home, like, you know, the floodlight comes on and the grass was just had lots of little moths.
That's
Right.
probably the army.
Well, that's what I was
probably
wondering if that's the
cosmopolitan
army. So now's there.
I should come and collect some actually, because the first step in looking at anything is to make sure the ID is correct.
Because
So I'll come and collect some, and we can send them off to.
it's not
To
too
get-
early for there to be a plague of what we call armyworm or grass.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
you're welcome to come out. Like, they were
Yeah.
everywhere.
So Anthony, would you like, if I'm on some acreage in Stockyard Road, if I've got any moths, do you want me to put some in a bench in my drawing room to you?
The issue with that is they flutter around and lose the scales on the wings. So you lose a lot of the colour. I'll bring a killing jar out. The best way to kill them is to get a fairly thick, heavy jar and freeze it. And then if you can sneak out and just put the lid on. I used to just walk around with an esky with several jars, and they slow down and they don't all flutter about. And then you can just go and put them in the freezer, and you end up with really nice specimens, and you can pin them out, and then we'll send them off. So I used to do that with the fruit piercing moth as well.
I'm trying to think where driving recently, I saw the ground looks as if it's being eaten by armyworm now, but the best indicator is the starlings and the sparrows. So
Yeah.
if you see them working somewhere on the common or in a paddock,
Yeah,
there's grubs there.
yeah,
And they've got more eyes than we have and more interested than we are.
Yeah. That's actually really interesting, because I've found birds very disappointing and lazy. They just won't go and eat the pests that I want them to.
Sparrows.
Oh, just birds in general. They've been a big disappointment to me.
Pretty well here.
Yeah, good, good.
Well, only the poultry growers feed them.
Yeah.
That's the pigeons.
And the pigeons.
The
yeah.
pigeons, okay. Well, I'm happy to put some jars in the freezer now.
Okay.
Come
Yeah,
out
yeah,
and,
yeah. Come out and get some, and
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think. I don't have my pinning gear. I wonder if Door would have some. I think they would. Yeah, because you need setting boards and things
Oh, okay.
for Lepidoptera. But yeah, no, we'll work something out for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
So you want the little board with the gap in the middle?
The gap in the middle and some tracing paper is the best. Even the oven baked non-stick stuff's really good.
I used that at work, but I don't know where.
I've got some at home, but not here. But you can make if we can get some styrofoam, you can cut I've made up my own plenty of times.
Can't hear you.
I'll have a look.
Okay. Sorry about that.
In terms of next steps for these,
Next steps. Look, I think the best thing to do is to try and spread the word. Anyone who you think would be interested in participating and getting involved, speak to them, pass on the information. We could tentatively put a time up. If you get a bunch of people who are interested in sitting around a table and going through all the documentation and having demonstrations of how to put the rearing containers together, and we could do a walk outside and do an example of filling the sheet in. I'm leaving on Thursday, so if you could always contact me and say, yeah, we've got a bunch of people interested in doing this, or that would be a way to do it.
I mean, we can send the documents out to Mark as well, and see if Flora and Fauna are keen.
Yeah.
I might wonder if we should send them to the garden club as well, acknowledgement. They might be
Yeah.
interested in that.
Yeah. And the Farming Alliance group.
You've got to be targeting people that are out there playing and looking, you know. You've got to go out there playing, but now you've got to kind of convince them to look at more than just the flowers or more than just the fruit.
Yeah.
But what like the guava especially, it's flowering and fruiting across the island can vary considerably, can't it, Derek?
Yeah. I remember when I was with Parks collecting guava for the Green Parrot program, they seem to ripen first at Cascade, Foresters Place, and it might have been Collins Head first.
And are they synchronous?
Cascade.
Are they synchronous? Like all the guava? Oh, so it's all staggered.
Some areas you can get 2 crops in a year, and then other areas.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it'll be some interesting timing and some interesting dates.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting data.
There's theoretically some improved varieties or different varieties of guava here as well, and more. I think they're intended to be the more commercial varieties from Australia, and it'll be interesting to see how they vary timing-wise as well, and whether they're a host. I don't even.
Well, that demonstrates the need, I guess, for fairly wide sampling, so that we get people from all over the island to be out looking. And that's another thing we can do. We could certainly sit down with a map and say we don't have anyone looking at this area who lives out that way and who is likely to be able to help us out.
One of the things that I've noticed with the couple of fruiting, one fruiting you can get, there's practically no grub. You can just eat them all. And the next fruiting, they've all got grubs.
Yeah.
So I don't know what, it must be just a different season or...
Research from New Zealand suggests that it can be very sporadic. It can just erupt and be a really bad pest and then nothing for a while. And like I say, there's just very little known about it. This might just end up giving us more questions than answers. But we don't know. There's no guarantee that it will lead us anywhere with it, but without the data we can't We just can't make informed decisions.
You've got to start somewhere, don't you?
Yeah, exactly.
See,
Yeah.
At home, it's not worth our while trying to grow nectarines because they just hit the nectarine.
Yeah.
And if they don't, if they don't hit it, the green parrots do. So,
Yeah.
Well, it's
Well,
interesting with the variations in climate we've had the last few years, because my nectarines and peaches last year started flowering in June, and I had my crop in September, and there was no whatsoever.
Yeah.
Whereas this year and previous years, it was much more of a November fruiting and full of them. So
That would be actually another really interesting bit of data to get. Yeah, to look at the prevalence of it. And yeah, we should consider that. So what we could do is say, yes, it's fruiting right now, and yes, it's got guava moth in it, and you could maybe sample 5 or 10 pieces of fruit, and you'll get some sort of indication of how heavy it is. It might be useful. Mm.
It certainly does vary across the island and
Yeah,
even across your yard.
Well, it's just, when I walk down the driveway, I've just guavas, and sometimes I can eat every single guava, and then another time of year I can't eat one because they've all got a grub in them.
Yeah.
Wish them well.
So you've had a situation where you've had really heavy infestations, and then after that you've had times when they've been better, or is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to be all or nothing.
Yeah.
For some reason, and I don't know what the reason is.
No, I don't think anyone does know. I mean, they might be putting out aggregation pheromones or.
The citrus, and I don't think we lost the citrus fruit with grubs in it, but some years they're not worth picking.
Hmm. See, it's possible that we could tie in the bad years to a heavy early guava fruiting. You know, it might just show something as simple as that. So they come out of there and then just spread. And the years that they don't, you don't have much of an issue with it. What we're trying to do is not look at ways we're going to be able to eradicate it, but just get more of those years when it's not such an issue. I mean, there are things you can do. You can spray it with kale and clay. That's quite a good option for a few things, actually. But it's time consuming and, yeah, it can be difficult. And again, it's no guarantee.